All right, for this last section, part 4, we are going to finish looking at the TF5 features and how they align to our last couple of components here. Situational appropriateness is the next one, and we align 1.3 behavioral expectations to this particular component. Usually we talk about setting up those school-wide expectations, positively stated, memorable, right? So we know this piece, but we elaborate here as we're thinking about how our expectations are reflective of the cultural values of our surrounding community. And so we want to make sure that the expectations we set up have a legitimate purpose within the setting, as opposed to just what is school tradition or maintaining a status quo. So within this culturally responsive framework, expectations need to focus on high standards and expectations for all students, and be able to be taught and learned, but also be respectful of students' cultures. We also align 1.4, the teaching of those expectations, with situational appropriateness. We're aware that 1.4 refers to that active and explicit teaching of school-wide expectations, but when we move into culturally responsive implementation, we look at how, as a PBIS team, can we ensure our school staff understand that all students need that explicit teaching about expected behavior at school. And we have a process and procedure for staff to teach students behaviors necessary to be successful in the school setting, or maybe different classroom settings, regardless of previous learning or without disrespecting families' beliefs. So how we approach that behavior matters. When expectations differ between home or community and school, we explicitly teach the differences, which might look like that code switching, right? Switching from that home environment or neighborhood environment to the school environment, and the purpose of having that expectation at school. So even thinking about, is this expectation necessary for this particular school environment? And then provide additional practice until students are able to demonstrate that expectation. And then we look at 1.5, those problem behavior definitions, which aligns to situational appropriateness. And we all know this to be those class and office managed behaviors that we organize into those T-charts, right? So that's how we've talked about it in prior professional learning with PBIS. So when we look at culturally responsive implementation, we assume that teams and staff understand the difference between universally acceptable and situationally inappropriate behaviors. We take responsibility for teaching what is wanted at school without devaluing what may be acceptable at home or in the community. And so behaviors that are determined to be unacceptable in the school setting must be grounded in actual purpose. And remember, along this process, we're also getting feedback from students and families as we include voice in this process. So a lot of these components kind of overlap here, right? So we're not just determining these things without input from students and families. So the differences between school and home community definitions of an unacceptable or undesired behaviors are discussed and mitigated with families and community, so that schools can truly reflect the communities they serve. We want to make sure that our school environment does not just reflect our values as educators, but also reflects the values of students and families. And this becomes very critical when you have a staff that might represent a certain dominant culture or might be somewhat homogeneous, maybe looking at a staff that might be even predominantly white, and then you might have a population that is very diverse. And so how do you think about how you represent expectations, right? Or how do you view problem behaviors, right? Wanting to make sure that we have that input and that voice from our students and our families. So in our next discussion, question 17, we want to consider the phrase shared. Within a culturally responsive framework, behavior expectations should focus on high standards for all students, be able to be taught and learned, and be respectful of students' cultures. So we want to review the last draft of our school-wide matrix that we created with our Salem Middle School staff, as well as feedback from students through Dr. Smith's student voice group. We want to reflect on whether we feel that our matrix meets this standard within this particular phrase. So let's take a minute to reflect, and let's share our thoughts in this next discussion question. Moving forward into the last component, which is data for equity, right? We spend a lot of time talking about data. We start with 112, which is discipline data. So do we have access to this behavioral data? Culturally responsive elaboration shares that we regularly disaggregate discipline data as an effective way to assess and monitor equity. So we have a purposeful examination of inequitable outcome data from a systems perspective before we view it as an issue with an individual student or family. Okay, so we look at that systems piece. So what can we do within our systems to address this particular data that we're seeing? And then, of course, 113, that next feature has to do with how we use that data in that data-informed decision-making process, right? So we talked a lot about this in our training. When we elaborate on this also refers to our PBIS teams engaging in active data-based decision-making with a specific focus on equity. So we take responsibility as a school staff for the outcomes of each student, regardless of his or her circumstances. And inequitable outcomes are first examined from that system perspective, as we talked about before we consider it an individual behavior for needed support. Next one is that fidelity data, right? So you know that we conduct those learning walks toward the end of the year where we assess where we are in terms of implementation fidelity. So how do we kind of expand this with a culturally responsive lens? So this means that not only do we engage in that learning walk and that reflection to assess our implementation, but we're committed to enhancing PBIS implementation with culturally responsive components. So how do we involve additional stakeholders and staff in this process of assessing for fidelity? Might this mean that we include some of our students or some of our families on our learning walks, right? So really being responsive to the views, the needs of our stakeholders. So we might use additional measures beyond what is nationally recognized in our specific TFI assessment that we use on our learning walks. We might gather some maybe anecdotal data from our families or from our students to specifically speak to equity outcomes for all students. And looking at the last TFI feature 115, which aligns with this component of data for equity, we know that we are accountable to our communities and stakeholders, and we have to report fidelity and effectiveness of implementation. We talk about this within our Tier 1 training that we've provided already. But when we elaborate on this with culturally responsive PBIS, we understand that teams and school staff play a critical role, and they're accountable to the communities we serve. And so annual evaluation procedures are used to engage a wide and representative range of stakeholders in two-way communication regarding goals and progress. And so how can we involve the voice of our students as well as our families as we set goals for progress in the future? So let's look at this next discussion, question 18. PBIS.org published a brief, and it's linked here, and I'll also provide it in the Schoology group. It provides an overview for teams to guide data-informed decision-making. It includes steps for problem analysis when responding to disproportionate data. So look at page 10 in the brief specifically, because it is a long brief, so let's just focus in on page 10. And share your thoughts on our team's ability to engage in this reflection and action planning around data. All right, so in our next discussion question, this is really a reflection on next steps. And I'm going to share a couple of examples here that I've identified in talking with some of our PBIS team school leaders. A couple of steps could involve these two here. Exploring identity and bias, right? So how do we consider how we might explore identity and implicit bias with staff as it relates to how we view and interact with staff, students, and families? And then looking at student and family involvement, understanding that that is a core foundation for culturally responsive PBIS. How might we consider creative ways to establish pathways for student and family involvement throughout the PBIS implementation process? We want to be creative here. How can we think outside the box and really be creative about how we pull in our students and families? And then share any other thoughts you might have about what next steps we might take with this information in mind that we have been learning around and interacting with. Share here in this discussion question what thoughts you might have for some additional next steps. So we go back to this statement here because contextual fit is a core principle of school-wide PBIS. It is not considered fully implemented until it is culturally responsive. So this is a core component. We want to bring us back to this goal. This is why we are engaging in this learning, because we understand that in order to implement PBIS effectively, we have to be culturally responsive. And so in this last discussion question, 20, let's just interact with each other and share some resources around what you believe would be beneficial reading for our PBIS team as we grow our knowledge in this area and increase our capacity to be culturally responsive through our PBIS implementation.